Welcome to Talkback. I'm privileged to have with me here today Shri Inder Kumar Gujral, former Prime Minister of India. Mr. Gujral has been at the center stage of the political scene in India for the past 50 years. I will be discussing with him his perspectives on the Indian economy as we look ahead. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
You have been intimately involved with the process of social and economic development of India since independence. You were at one time regarded as a socialist political person, and then over the years, especially when you were Prime Minister of India, you took very active steps to push forward the process of economic reforms that was set in motion in the 1990s. I would like to ask you how you view this process of economic reform and what made you change your mind?
Kindly keep one thing in mind. Basically, I have been a socialist. I continue to be socialist. Because to me, the interpretation of socialism means social justice. It does not mean a dogma. And I think those societies which have been dogmatic, they have not seen light of the day. I think one reason why India has been able to swim through different times, different periods, is since Nehru's days, we have never been dogmatic. You remember earlier time when Jawaharlal Nehru was in the helm of the affairs, he started describing the system as socialistic pattern of society. I go with that. But I also am conscious of Indian poverty, and also how a large number of people are still below poverty line. Nobody with heart and with vision can be anything but socialist so far as social justice is concerned. So I have not changed from that. The only thing that must keep on adjusting to the times is the pattern of managing economy to try to benefit the maximum number of people. I feel that many things have changed. For instance, one thing which has changed is that the Cold War has ended. The world has opened it to itself. It is now possible to think in terms of a broader dimension than narrow nationalistic dimension. There was a time when national sovereignty was confined to the states. Now we look at it in terms of region and going beyond that. And that is not something which India is doing itself, but I think every new society, whether old society, has to really meet this challenge. So therefore, when I started talking in terms of adjusting with the new realities, it was neither divorcing from the commitment to the people and their welfare, nor was it meant to subserve itself to the interests of others.
But you know, there are many who believe that during the first 40 years after our independence, we really practiced more of state capitalism rather than socialism. And later on, we have now moved to the market, and we need to use the state judiciously. We need to intervene, in such a way that we can make markets work.
You see, there are many people who use jargons for simple situations. What was called state capitalism was not capitalism. We became free at a time when we didn't have any capital at all, and we wanted to build the nation. What were the options before Nehru at that time? For instance, supposing you wanted to build a steel plant. There was not anybody in the private sector which could really set up a new steel plant.
Inderji, a logical consequence of that would be that today, when there is a private sector which is vibrant and can run a steel plant, then the state should not be making losses.
I agree with you on this, but main point is that when you withdraw from certain sectors, we must ensure two things. One, that that particular sector will run with efficiency, and also the benefits will be not derived by a few people, but by larger society as a whole. I am not in favor of expansion of the public sector, as I was not at that time. For instance, when I said that there were certain sectors which were capital intensive, Therefore, the state had to come in. But later on, as the time developed, the time came, we unfortunately went into those sectors where we need not have gone.
Today, if there are private companies who are capable of taking over and running, should the state be spending its energies on that?
No, I would put it differently. Decision making, whether which company should be disinvested, where we should not disinvest, should not be taken by the government. At one time, you remember, we had set up the commission. And my objection today is that commission has been abolished.
But there is a department of disinvestment.
So it should not be. Department of the government should not decide, because then all of the other considerations will come in, as you are mentioning. I would think that an independent commission which was set up in my time, that commission should be really the forum for deciding, because they can discuss any particular case on its merits. There are two things which are really coming in our way on any radical change. One is the fear. You see, the corruption is very significant factor which any policymaker tries to guard against. What I am trying to say is that fear of being branded as corrupt, it becomes a very inhibiting factor. I'll tell you one interesting thing. Once I called a meeting as a Prime Minister of the leading bankers, and I asked them, public sector, I said, why don't you give money to people? You have got so much money. Everyone was listening until I repeated myself 2 or 3 times. One of the general managers got up and he said, sir, permit me to be frank. If I were to give 10,000 loans and 999 are all right, if one goes wrong, you order a CBI inquiry. I had no reply. And CBI inquiries are not ordered by so much by the government as a media pressure, because immediately you come to that conclusion. That is where it has stood in the way of quicker pace for the disinvestment, or whatever you might call it, privatization. Because any policymaker is so much afraid, and the media is, and the witch hunting. As in my opening speech in the parliament, I had said I am against corruption, but I am also against witch hunting.
You know, given the political economy of the public sector, then the solution seems to be that government should really withdraw from banking and these areas and really focus on health and education, which no private sector can deliver.
If you ask me, in principle, I agree with you. I think the trouble is in the details, not in the principle. Details, again, when you go to who should choose, who should select, what should be the process. And that is where the problem has arisen all the time. The vested interests of 2 types. One, who do not want a change, and even if it is run inefficiently. Second, this witch hunting psychology. We have to clear, and that is why I say that disinvestment procedures should not be settled by the government.
And they must be transparent.
Totally transparent, but independent commission.
Inderji, first as Foreign Minister and then as Prime Minister, you had really played a leading role in changing our approach towards our neighborhood. And even on economic issues, you really had revived SAARC and talked about free trade agreements between India and our neighbors. And of course, the political atmosphere today is very different from what it was when you were Prime Minister. But in today's atmosphere, do you see the prospect of reviving SAARC and economic cooperation and economic integration in the region?
I am entirely committed to that, and I continue to be on the same thinking. I think the destiny of this area, South Asia, lies in regional cooperation. As a matter of fact, I don't mind sharing with you, only today I have written Prime Minister a letter suggesting that even talking to Pakistan should be via the SAARC, because then ultimately we are able to really decide which destiny we are aiming at. I feel that our economies are so complementary, we can help each other so much, that ultimately we have to really go together. The misfortune came not because of India. The SAARC got a setback because of Kargil. But I think it is time that we got away from that psychology. We cannot go on thinking or remain prisoner of the Kargil. I think Pakistan has to make up its mind also. And the mind that they have to make up is about whether they have really faith in regional cooperation or they don't. Because while talking of regional cooperation, Nawaz Sharif, myself and Hasina Sheikh in the last round and Male in the first round, we had really identified the milestones. We have said by 2001, we will come to a stage where free trade zone can be established whole of South Asia. By 2003, we will start moving towards South Asian Economic Community. It was our confirmed opinion of all of us, the entire SAARC, Prime Ministers and the heads of the government, that if South Asian Community comes to be about, then it will be very easy for us to solve more difficult problems also. Whether I talk in terms of economy or I talk in terms of political relationships, SAARC must not be underestimated.
And yet, you know, when you look at the free trade agreement that we signed with Sri Lanka or with Bangladesh for that matter, it has not been smooth. There has been so much resistance, and Indian industry seems to be not taking it too well.
Isha, when you go towards this new era, after all, for last 50 years we have been moving all in different directions. It is never going to be smooth. No change is ever smooth. But also at the same time you find changing psychology. For instance, when I sorted out the water dispute, everyone thought it can never be done. It was done. India-Sri Lanka free trade when we started. Now you talk to an average Sri Lankan. Of course we have difficulty in tea trade and all those things. Every new step will always have roadblocks. But we must learn that whether our vision is clear or not and whether we have done the homework or not.
Talking about new steps, you know, one of the major changes that we are all waiting for is on April 1, when all quantitative restrictions on imports will go. Now, this is not really so much a WTO commitment, as you know, it is a pre-WTO commitment of India, and we are going to be doing this. And again, there is tremendous apprehension. We hear about imports from China flooding, and there is fear that floodgates of imports will be opened. Are you worried about that?
I am. I'm quite worried about it. Because I was chairman of the committee before I joined the government of the parliament. At that time we were discussing Dunkel draft. And we had given a very comprehensive report on the dangers that it spells and the opportunities that it offers. We try to balance both. After balancing, the report suggested that we join WTO, but we must be conscious of the following issues. Now, you see, the difficulty about the quantity restriction removal is that the areas where we have advantages, we are not getting them. Agriculture is one of them. Textile is another one. The developed countries are not opening up. Secondly, when we signed this quantity restriction, we were hoping that our economies are such that if subsidies are removed all over, then agriculture will go in our favor. Then we see, as we see in WTO today, that the major countries of the world, America and Europe, they are giving subsidies by hidden means. Blue box, green box, what nonsense are they talking of. So therefore we are really worried from that point of view. One of our failings is that we have really not been able to train bureaucrats how to negotiate in WTO. This by itself is an area of specialization. And other countries are more skillful than us. So simultaneously we must build that cadre. As a matter of fact, I had suggested during my tenure that in the Ministry of External Affairs we must have a separate wing where we recruit the budding liars, post them in WTO headquarters as well as here, so that they become very accomplished negotiators. We don't have them as yet. This is one difficulty. Second difficulty at the moment is that when I was talking to President Clinton and this issue came up, I told him, I said, give us enough time to prepare. Well, enough time, I think, has not been given to us for getting adequate preparation done for the removal of the quantity restrictions. You see, these apprehensions are very far-reaching, because I do not know how will our agriculture compete once I don't see the way out.
But you know, when I asked the same question to Mr. Devegowda, his response was, and there are many who take that view, that it is not the WTO, but it is our own policies in agriculture which have led to a decline in public investment in agriculture, increase in subsidies. So we are really striking at the root of our own competitiveness. We cannot blame. Of course, we have to fight for our rights in the WTO, but we also have to work towards improving our competitiveness.
I agree with that. Our competitiveness must be improved. Our more investment in agriculture is called for. It is no use now crying over the spilled milk that my grandfather did not put more money in agriculture. But all the same, if I am the government, my responsibility is there to safeguard my interests and safeguard the interest of farming community. After all, we have 70% population of the country dependent on that, rightly or wrongly. Till that reality exists, I have, as a policy maker, to face that reality more.
But another very sticky area is really this policy of reservation for the small scale sector. Would you be unequivocally for a withdrawal of the reservation policy for the small scale sector?
No.
Why would you say that?
Well, my reasons are very different. Of course, it needs case-to-case study, and one can decide where to withdraw, where not to withdraw. But let us keep in mind the fact all the time that we are a country of the poor people, and employment here matters a lot. Since the major companies we are coming in, not employment oriented, and I create millions of people jobless. After all, when we took to private sector, this small scale sector, they are the biggest employers. But I am willing to discuss industry by industry. For instance, there are certain items which are export oriented. There perhaps we can withdraw, because a small scale biscuit manufacturer may not be able to compete, say, in Timbuktu. But also at the same time, for instance, I give you one very interesting instance. At one time, Bangalore city alone had 35 biscuit manufacturers. One of them was a person known to me. I went there a couple of years ago and I asked him. He had closed his factory. I said, why? He said, because the big manufacturers who have come, they are not manufacturing. They are brand sellers.
But you see, this is the point, that the small scale reservation is being abused, because you will not allow them to produce on the large scale. What they do is they take from different small scale units, put their brand on it, so it doesn't really achieve.
Where another dimension comes in, Isha. It is not a question of policy being wrong. It is a question of the investment coming in, not in manufacturing but takeovers. And takeovers are of different types. For instance, the entire cosmetic sector has been taken over by one company. Even the brands are the same. You still hear the Tata's Acme and what it called.
Acme.
Only ownership has changed. Entire area of what was called Dalda, the Banaspati, has been taken over. All edible oils have been taken over, and all by one company. This new monopoly is a danger, not a attempt for us. And even if the bigger company is not able to understand this type of takeovers, if Godrej could not take this pressure, if the Tatas could not, then has Indian manufacturing improved? Are more jobs created? Has more industry come in?
That is the real test. I would like to ask you two questions. First is that when you open an economy to imports, naturally you can't create monopolies, because in a closed economy you could have a Tata's or a whatever. But once you open, there are always imports to keep you in check. So this is one question that one has to keep in mind. And the second, more broad question I would like to ask you is, what do you see as the role of direct foreign investment?
You see, it is very interesting. Only 2 weeks back, I was in a conference in Zurich. Of course, the subject of the conference was aging, because in the developed countries, there are more aged than young. So the implications of that. And one of the implications we discussed was, where do they invest the provident funds? And I said investment in our country is welcome, but most of the investment is coming in portfolios and not in enhancing or increasing our manufacturing capacity. And what these gentlemen do is that they fly by night investment. They come, the stock market booms of one day, they withdraw the money, it crashes, and the only small investor gets crushed.
Actually, I think thanks to you and all the other governments, if you take an international perspective on India, what we find is that our government has been very, very careful about opening to portfolio investment. Yes. Where the problem has been is the direct foreign investment. We want it in infrastructure, but it seems to go into consumer goods.
Well, even if consumer goods, I don't mind, as long as it creates more manufacturing capacity. Yes. That is, I prefer the infrastructure. But if that is not coming for the time being, I am not so worried. I am more worried if it is only in the speculation and creating a casino atmosphere. Casino economies are the ones which crushed the East Asia when the crisis came. You know, we had a conference in Seoul by the UNDP, and I was there, and 36 countries. We were discussing this. Why did these countries go? One of them said, because the overinvestment in real estate. I said, when did you do it? A few days before the crash, you were giving the good certificates, Tigers and all that. They're remarkable good economies. The difficulty is that, unfortunately, sometimes we become victims of their propaganda. And since their media is more powerful, we think we are always wrong. And our public opinion makes us believe that perhaps by not opening we are wrong, by opening we are wrong, by investment we are wrong, by non-investment we are wrong. Main point basically is therefore an enlightened public opinion, which is very analytical, which is also very conscious of the national interest. And national interest must be spelt in terms of the people, not in terms of the elite.
I think there can be no two opinions about that. But let me, in the end, ask you a very fundamental question. You know, we started reforms because government was spending too much and government fiscal deficits were rising. Now we've had reforms for 10 years. Today, when you look at the fiscal deficit of the center and the states put together, it's actually higher, over 10%, compared to what it was when we launched the process of reform. Now, is this something that worries you?
Yes, it does.
And what should be done about it?
You see, fiscal deficit is a matter of great anxiety. Our difficulty in a country when you manage a government is that organized trade unionism, particularly in the government sector, is very powerful.
You should know that.
I have dealt with it when I was dealing with Fifth Pay Commission. And say many problems arose because the salaries went up so high.
But I think many people believe that it was unnecessary.
Well, many people believe who were not many we were confronted with the situation of a universal strike. I would not have bothered so much if it was a secretariat strike. But supposing rail stopped, post office stopped, bank stopped. How long could I face that? And I would rather give in before that than after that.
But let me ask you another question. Even if you had to give in to what the Pay Commission had recommended, they had another side to the package, which was downsizing the government.
Correct.
Many of us economists feel that you had a golden opportunity when you were giving the Pay Commission pay scales, that you should have started the process of downsizing.
In principle, we agreed. It is the detail which was our enemy. How do you send a government servant home with the constitutional guarantees of the security of his job? And that is something which keeps on bothering my successor government also. And I think ultimately difficulty in India is that because we are a country of the poor, mobility of labor is not possible. Mobility of employment is not there. So therefore, when you ask a man to go home, there should be some options available. You know, in the countries where labor policy is different, mobility is possible because options are available.
There is a pattern in our country that whenever a party is in power, you know, they are more willing to take rational economic decisions. And when they are in the opposition, they don't make it easy for the government of the day to function.
I think the responsibility of a government also is to create consensus. And I think skill of a government, I feel, is judged by its method and style of creating a consensus. When you were talking about the SARC policies or CTBT, without meaning anything personal, I succeeded because I created consensus first. Economic policy reforms will succeed only if a government in office gives a great deal of attention to consensus. And I had once told the Prime Minister while talking about the nuclear, I said, kindly understand the difference between giving information and consensus. These are two different things. You can't call a meeting of the parties and give them information. Do you satisfy them? For instance, in the SARC discussions, and particularly in discussions regarding Pakistan, I modified my stand several times because the present Prime Minister was leader of opposition. He wanted to take a different approach, and we saw the sense in what he was saying. So therefore, this is the main point, particularly in economic reforms. Economic reform in India will succeed only if consensus backs it up. And consensus generation is not the responsibility of opposition. Sense is, of course, there must be expected from them. But initiative has to come from the government in office.
Very good. On that very positive note, let me thank you, Inderji. We'll be back same time, same day next week. Until then, goodbye.